Good morning, Reality Church. Wow, wasn't that amazing? We are in week 3 of a series called It's On Me, and it's all about finances. And if you're like, well, that doesn't really sound exciting, I would challenge that with what we just heard. Like, if we haven't stepped into that level of freedom, I was sitting there, I'm like, man, that's a check I would love to write. And there's so many of you right now that you're like, man, if I could do that. And that's what's actually very exciting about finances, and especially when we apply God's principles to them, and then what's possible through us as we release that, as we're going to talk about today, to great causes like that. That was so impactful. So if you were here 2 weeks ago, we started this series, and Joe started off talking about tithing. And if you remember his little bag and his basket, he talked about the different ways and the perspectives that we look at money. And then last week, Lindsay did a great job of talking about a simplistic lifestyle or a simplistic focus. And today I want to start by acknowledging and recognizing how detailed our God really is. When you look at creation and its endless details, do you know, and you will after I tell you, that there's a hummingbird, the thing is like this big, and its wings flap or beat at 80 times a second. Not a minute, a second. 1 second, that little bird's wings, 80 times. I can't even wrap my head around how much detail goes in to creating something like that. And our human bodies, we have cells that regenerate, and our bodies have the ability to heal themselves. So much detail. And in the Old Testament, the tabernacle of Moses, it was this portable tabernacle that they set up everywhere the Israelites went, and it housed the presence of God. It had the outer court, the inner court, and the Holy of Holies. There was so much instruction and detail down to like the thread in the fabric and the specific color. We serve a God of the details. And so recognizing that, I think we can apply some sense of logic and say, okay, well, if God cares about the smallest details, should we maybe apply a certain level of attention to detail to our finances? Can we agree? That's a good place to start. And so the book of Proverbs, we're going to pull the e-brake in Proverbs today. We really don't even get outside of Proverbs. There's so much wisdom, and there's so much here in Proverbs. It's almost overwhelming when it comes to wisdom and stewardship we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start in Proverbs 27 in verse 23 through 27. You can follow on the screens. It says, be sure, and this is Solomon, the wisest man that I believe ever lived, speaking to his son, imparting some wisdom. He says in verse 23, be sure you know the condition of your flocks. Give careful attention to your herds, for riches do not endure forever, and a crown is not secure for all generations. When the hay is removed and new growth appears, and the grass from the hills is gathered in, the lambs will provide you with clothing, and the goats with the price of a field. You will have plenty of goat's milk, delicious, goat's milk to feed your family and to nourish your female servants. And so Solomon here is saying, you have to pay attention to what's in front of you. You have to pay attention. There might be a season where you're sowing a lot, and then that grass is cut down and you bring that in, and there may be a season where you can't harvest out there, and now it's time to feed them what you've set aside. And you might have to take some of your goats and sell them off, and maybe you're looking ahead to next season, and you're going to take some of those goats and you're going to sell them off and reinvest and buy some more land because your herd is growing. All that to say, Solomon's saying, pay attention to what you're given. And how do we do that? This brings us to a concept that we often hear within the church, stewardship. And stewardship is the careful, which we just heard here is Solomon, the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. It's not mine, it's been placed in my care. And often, like when I think about this, I think, well, if it's mine, sometimes I can be sloppy with it. But if someone trusts me enough to give me something and say, hey, take care of this, I'm more conscious of how I treat that because I'm like, well, this isn't mine. I can't mess this up. And that's this concept of stewardship and all of our, so whether we're talking about careers or marriages or spouses, parenting our kids, when we see that all through the lens of, I am simply a steward. God has placed those resources in my hands, and now it's up to me to guard, protect, to multiply those resources using God's principles. That's really when we see the abundant life. And I'm not talking about in numbers and a certain threshold that you're making in your career. I'm talking about peace, freedom to give into ministries, freedom, margin where you can actually breathe and relax and you're not stressed about it. This is a fundamental belief I believe we have to grab onto if we're to experience everything that God has for us. And this cannot be accomplished without wisdom and planning and budgeting. And that's what we're talking about today, planning and budgeting. Ushers, lock the doors, okay? So, but like I said, when we look at finances, and it's not just, oh my goodness, money is so boring. When we look at this as seed placed in our hands to sow and watch multiply, that's life-giving. That should be exciting. We should seek after wisdom on this topic. And I get lazy sometimes, and I just don't do that. Proverbs 1:7 says this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so if this is the starting point to wisdom, the fear of the Lord, and when I say fear, often we're like, that's bad. Fear is a good thing. The fear of the Lord involves awe, reverence, a love, and a trust in God. That's the fear of the Lord. So if that's the starting point to knowledge and to wisdom, I feel like we need to investigate that a little more, and that's what we're going to do today. So knowledge, you're going to hear words over and over through Proverbs. Knowledge is kind of collected information, and wisdom is the workman. Wisdom helps to apply the knowledge that you've acquired. And discretion, here's another word you hear, it's the ability to ponder and to plan. And prudence, so another word we don't use often, it foresees and it deals with difficulties. It uses good judgment. Proverbs 4:7-10, and this is Solomon talking to his son, and listen to how he paints the picture of what wisdom looks like. The beginning of wisdom is this: wisdom, though it cost all you have, get understanding. He personifies wisdom here. Cherish her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. She will give you a garland to grace your head and present you with a glorious crown. Listen, my son, accept what I say, and the years of your life will be many. I love how he paints this picture, and I love, as a father having a son, how he paints this as like wisdom being this female. And if you know Solomon, he had an affinity for women, right? Maybe his son inherited some of this, and he's saying, son, I have gone after all that. But if you want to lock in on something that's worth going after, go after Lady Wisdom. And I love how he personifies wisdom in that way to his son. That's just kind of how I wrap my head around that. So this kind of sets us on a course where we're choosing between two paths. And we're going to read Proverbs 9:1-12. This Proverbs 9 is split into two. We have Lady Wisdom, which we're going to talk about first, and then we have Lady Folly or foolishness. And folly, listen to this, is not just, whatever, I'm just not going to choose the right path. It actually holds in contempt the pursuit of truth, and it says, I'm going to take my own path. So often I think we think there's this like neutral where we can kind of like be in between. But I would challenge you as we read here that that's not actually the truth. We actually hold in contempt the pursuit of truth by choosing our own path. Proverbs 9:1-12, and this is Lady Wisdom. Wisdom has built her house. Notice that wisdom goes to work. Get to work. Wisdom has built her house. She has set up its 7 pillars. She has prepared her meat and mixed her wine. Look at all the detail here. She has set her table, and she has sent out her servants. And she calls from the highest point of the city, let all who are simple come to my house. To those who have no sense, she says, come, Eat my food and drink the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and you will live. Walk in the way of insight. Verse 7. Whoever corrects a mocker invites insults. Whoever rebukes the wicked incurs abuse. Do not rebuke mockers or they will hate you. Rebuke the wise and they will love you. That's interesting. Instruct the wise and they will be wiser still. Teach the righteous and they will add to their learning. And you see it again here. Does this sound familiar? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. For through wisdom your days will be many, and years will be added to your life. If you are wise, your wisdom will reward you. And if you're a mocker, you alone will suffer. I love how, and when he says days will be added to your life, he's not necessarily talking about eternity. He's talking about physical days and how this wisdom helps you to have a longer life, a life of peace. And I love how wisdom just goes straight to work. Is there any better feeling when you have guests coming over and you have the entire house clean? Because if you're like my wife and I, that's really the only time the house is spotless, is when you're having guests coming over. But you've spent the day preparing, you're scrubbing, you're cleaning, everything is in order and it's in its place. And the table is set, and maybe the wine's out, and the meat's coming off the grill, and everything's in place, and you sit back and you go, doesn't that feel so good? And that's the picture I get here, that Lady Wisdom went straight to work. She built her house and she set the table. To have this kind of perspective and wisdom, it takes work. And I love this picture. And now listen to this. Listen to the opposite. This is folly. 9:13 through 18 now. Folly is an unruly woman. She is simple and knows nothing. She sits, laziness. Do you see how different already this looks? She sits at the door of her house, on a seat at the highest point in the city, calling out to those who pass by, who go straight on their way. Let all who are simple come to my house. To those who have no sense, she says, stolen water is sweet. Food eaten in secret is delicious. But little do they know that the dead are there, that her guests are deep in the realm of the dead. Notice how both wisdom and folly are crying out to those who don't have any understanding and say, come in and partake. But notice how folly handled this. Stolen water in secret. Right? Deceit, deceiving. And these are, to me, this is two totally different paths that we are invited. And actually, I would say if we're really paying attention today and honest, we can identify which path we're on. And so I invite you to do that as we continue through this. And so often we have a basic knowledge. When we're talking about planning and budgeting and numbers and finances, we have a basic operating knowledge of what we should be doing. So why don't we just do it? Why don't we just know what the right decision is? And I've asked myself, why don't you just do it? And here's the key. Because you and I both know that finances, it's way more than numbers. There's emotions tied to it. And when you spend beyond your means, in a moment it feels so good. That car that you were trying to wait and save for and not go into debt for, you now are like, no, I want it now. That feels good, right? And so we've all done this. Like we trip up and we give into our emotions. And so we all can admit that numbers and finances, it's way more than just that. There's emotions tied to our money. And so this is, I will just be honest, this is not a very strong point for me. And I have to be very transparent with you. I struggle in this area. Not just to come up with a plan, but to stick to the plan. To not be like, yeah, but I really wanted, I didn't budget for, but oh well. So I am not. There's probably a lot of people in this room more qualified to give this talk than I am. And I just want to be perfectly honest with you guys and transparent. This is an area that I have a lot of work to do. And so we're going to put these two paths now in layman's terms. And the first one, wisdom, Lady Wisdom, we're going to call this, so we're looking at paradigms. Often when we make decisions, like we just talked about out of our emotions, It's because of the way that we see money or we see finances. And it's like glasses. It's like, this is the lens that I see finances through. And often that's formed at a very young age through experience, and now we act out of that almost subconsciously. And so Lady Wisdom, we're going to call that the if only mindset versus the I will mindset. We're going to start with Lady Folly, if only, okay? So what characterizes an if only or a foolish mindset or paradigm? Excuses. If only I made more money. You don't have to raise your hands, but if you've ever said this to yourself, I would budget if I made more money. There's just not really anything there. There's no extra, so why budget? But if only I made more, I would do it. I would be diligent then. Characterized by blame. If only my boss wasn't the way they were. I always get passed up for the promotion. I'm never going to get it. Blame. Somebody else's fault. Thirdly, procrastination and laziness. And we just saw that here with Lady Folly. If only I had more time, I would sit. I've found myself saying that, and yet I've sit there with my phone for hours. Knowing something needed to be handled, knowing things needed to be done, knowing that budget needs a lot of work, but I'm numbing. I'm just like, I know it needs done. Some point I'll get to it. Procrastination and laziness. If. The ifs keep us in this cycle. It's like a downward spiral when this is a lens that we see through. Excuses, blame, procrastination. And it leads to, and I've experienced this, feelings of just deep regret. If you've never had like financial stress, the kind that keeps you awake at night, restless, it's an awful, awful thing. And it keeps you in this perpetual cycle of poor decisions. And it starts to feel like, I will never, ever figure this out. I don't know what to do. The if-only way of thinking is a dangerous trap. And it only compounds those mistakes. Remember the Israelites who left captivity? They were now free. They had the freedom. They wanted to be out. No more slavery. They were free. Moses leads them out, and the first sign of a setback, what do they say? If only we were back in Egypt. If only we were sitting around those pots of meat that we had. First sign of adversity, and they were longing to be captives again. Blame leads to captivity, and it seeks comfort over sacrifice. You see, they left. Their surroundings looked like they were free, but they left with a captive mindset. And we see this, don't we, with people in poverty who win the lottery. It's like they get the windfall. Lindsay talked about this last week. What would you get that lottery, right? But they get this windfall. Do you know that within 5 years, no matter the amount, it could be multiple millions of dollars, within 5 years, 70% of lottery winners are not only broke, but often worse off than they were before they won the lottery. Why is that? Their surroundings, their circumstances, you say, oh, that person's free. They're free now. They have all that money. But they went into that not changing anything with their mindset, and they were still captives, and it led to captivity. How about the rich young ruler who approached Jesus and he said, good servant, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus gives him kind of a short list of commandments. It's almost like, as I read this, it's almost like he interrupts him and says, hold up, I've done all that, master, since I was a young boy. And it says, he looked at him with love and said, there's one thing you lack. Go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then come and follow me. Because Jesus knew he was captive. And do you think if I'm in his mind, the rich young ruler, I don't say to myself, oh man, if only Jesus knew how hard I'd worked to get to this point in my career. If only he knew I had these 5 more pieces of land and I was going to be set after acquiring them. If only he knew. And it says he turned in sadness because he had great wealth. See, maybe the sin or where we get off course isn't always in not planning. Maybe it's in not setting those plans, before God and saying, God, what direction do you want me to go with my finances? I have all these plans, I have all these hopes and dreams, but God, what do you think? It's all yours anyway. Proverbs 3:5-6 says this, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. The if-only mindset, we can sum it up, it's marked by excuses and blame. And the fruit of this, operating in this, worry, anxiety, fear that there's never going to be enough, fear that you're always going to have lack. And on the opposite end of this, now we get to Lady Wisdom. And we're going to call this the I will mindset. And what does that look like when you have an I will mindset or paradigm? It's the name of our series. It's on me. Personal responsibility and ownership. If I make a mistake here, it's on me. Maybe I have to go back to the drawing board and I have to make a little adjustment. Author Napoleon Hill said, if you can run a losing race, without blaming your loss on someone else, you have bright prospects of success farther down the road in life. Why? Because you look inward. You don't look out to your circumstance and say, that person is the fault, that they're the reason I'm here. No, you look inward and say, what adjustments can I make so that I'm not in this same position? So I'm not always on the losing end. Look inward. Sacrifice. I will give up what I really want now for the sake of something much better later. This is a key. Continual learning. These are things that mark an I will mindset, a healthy view. Continual learning. I will seek after wisdom like it's hidden treasure, like Proverbs talks about. And prudence. I will use skill and good judgment in the use of resources stewarded, trusted to me to manage by God. Think of Abraham and Isaac, that son that he wanted so badly. And God says, I want you to take your son, I want you to sacrifice him, his only son. And in what seems like a ridiculous yes, he says, okay, God, I'm stewarding this, and I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to sacrifice my son. And I had never heard this until I heard this week. A pastor said, it feels like a setup, doesn't it? That we'd be so enraged that Abraham would take his son. And I feel it's like, God, why would you ask him to do that? And Abraham, why would you follow through? And then later on in the New Testament, when God follows through and lays his son at the altar for us, doesn't that feel a little bit like a setup? Doesn't it point to how selfish we can be? Because Abraham and Isaac doesn't feel like it really affects us, right? But Jesus dying on the cross for us, well, that helps me, right? That's a little insight into how selfish we can be. You see, I will values obedience. And what if we exercise that level of faith, that level of obedience when it comes to our response to God and how we handle our finances? You see, Abraham understood that God always gets first and best. And there's times in my life where I have deliberately not given God my first and best, and somebody else is getting it. Because somebody is always getting your first and best. Someone's always getting your affection. And if it's not God, and I have to be really honest, there's been times in my life where I have done this. And like I said earlier, it's not just neutrality. It's actually holding in contempt the right way or the pursuit of truth. Lastly, the parable of the talents. The master calls in his 3 servants. He gives one talent. He gives one 3 and one 5. And he says, I'm leaving. I'm placing these in your hands. And it says immediately when they left, the ones with 5 and 3, they went immediately to work and they multiplied it. And what did the one with 1 talent do? He buried it, right? And what did he say to the master when he came back? He said, I knew you were a difficult man, and you harvested where you didn't sow. So I just buried it You know what I think? I think he had other things on his agenda. I think he was lazy. And the other two actually knew the character of their master, and they said, we serve a good master. Let's go to work. Let's multiply this. And when he comes back, man, it's gonna bring him so much joy and excitement. They understood and knew. And if I look at my own life, when I make the decision to go opposite of God's ways, it's not just, like I said, neutrality. It's actually me attacking the character of God. The loving God who created me and gave me the very breath in my lungs. It's me attacking his character. And that's hard to even say. So to sum up the I will mindset, it's marked by wisdom, sacrifice, and responsibility. And peace and contentment are the fruit. This is God's best for us. This is what a loving Father invites us into, to live in freedom, to not be captive to our finances, but to be free and to give freely, to be generous as we work, as we seek him on what we do with our finances and how we handle that. And a good place to start, and I had to do this week, was to ask some really hard questions as to where my trust is with God. And do I really have a grasp of his character and how badly he wants me to live in freedom? Or do I attack his character over and over? You see, what I can't do is I can't continue to read and say that I trust him, violate his principles, and then think I get some backdoor loophole to where I still get his blessings. It doesn't work. It's going to leave me frustrated. It's going to leave me angry because I feel like I deserve it. All the while, I'm violating his principles. Secondly, this might look like inviting someone in. This is a really hard thing to do when it comes to finances, isn't it? We feel like we don't want anyone to see what's over here. That's a really big thing to invite somebody into. But for some of you, you might have tried and failed, but like me, tried and failed. And so what do? You stop trying because you're just dejected and you're almost emotionally detached from it. And it might take you inviting someone in, someone you trust, someone qualified to say, can you walk with me? Can you show me what this looks like to be diligent? And for me, it starts with, God, could you forgive me for violating your principles, for questioning character and your goodness? A great place to start as we talk today is a working budget. Everybody say working. That means it's actually working, right? It's not this ethereal thing where it's out there and somehow it's all going to work out in the end. It's not how it works. A working budget, knowing the numbers, be realistic, and make strategic adjustments. You cannot adjust something that you don't know. You can feel like you're spending the minimal amount, and then when you look at that on paper, you're like, wow, that was 18 trips to Starbucks this month, and that was $4 a pop, minimum. And you start to see where, wow, if I just brew my coffee at home, I can free up. But like we said earlier, there's something emotional. And I walk in there like, hey, Lee. I'm like, that's right. Right? There's something emotional there. There's something that pulls us into that. And when I look, and when I see opportunities like what we heard about here this morning, and I say, man, I could actually go into my budget, and I could know the numbers, and I could squeeze, and I could pinch, and I could give, and I could sow seeds somewhere. That is exciting. And lastly, as we close, don't ever discount the supernatural. Because what happens is I'm over here doing my own thing, and I'm stressed and I'm frustrated, and there's like this shower head here. And when I begin to follow, obey, obedience, and I position myself underneath that faucet, now what am I in position for? His blessings. I don't say, God, I'm here, I tithe now, and I even gave $50 as an offering this week. Now you have to bless me. Once again, attacking the character of God. If I trust in his goodness and I follow and obey, I know I am positioned to where I can receive. And then it's up to him to open that faucet and to bless me to whatever level he decides to bless me. We serve a God who parts oceans. We serve a God of miracles. And sometimes all it takes is one step to reposition and say, God, forgive me. I'm going to obey now. And watch as he showers blessings on us. And we just take that and we just begin to sow into ministries. And it's not always what we hear. Some of the most powerful ways you can give is you just going about your day and God speaks to you and says, go. That's on you. Go fill that person's tank. That's exciting. That's an adventure. That's how God's kingdom is multiplied. So don't ever discount the supernatural and allow God to work through you to unlock that and your faith and your trust in him, and watch as that explodes. And as we heard about this morning, God's kingdom just being expanded by our obedience. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for all the wisdom that you have laid out in front of us in your word. But God, sometimes it takes a step on our end of obedience to go seek after that wisdom, to apply some of that knowledge in our lives, to be diligent, to be prudent. God, to do the hard work of sitting and looking at numbers, which feels just like, sometimes. But God, to know that your son Jesus talked so much about finances because he knew we could so easily be imprisoned by them. And for so many of us in this room today, we are captive to money. We are slaves. And for some, we have none, and yet we're still slaves to it. And God, you knew that we would have the potential to fall into that trap. And that's why you speak so much in your word about wisdom, about planning, about being prudent, about having a budget, and about tracking. So God, would you help us to see outside of our little box to what is possible when we step into obedience in all the areas of our lives, not just where we feel safe or feel comfortable giving those areas to you. I just ask for boldness, and God, as you were speaking to me this morning about burning in our hearts obedience, just a desire for obedience. I just pray that everyone in here would leave with more of a desire to be obedient, and however that looks. It's in your beautiful name we pray. Amen. Guys, if you do me a favor on your way out, grab one of the deep dive postcards. It is a great opportunity to ask some really tough questions about faith, to have some food, and just have a great time. Guys, have a great day. Love you all.